You can support In the Past Lane with as little as $1 a month. Just go to the support page at our website, inthepastlane.com. Thanks. On March 15th, 1783, George Washington, having learned of a possible mutiny by officers in the Continental Army, confronted the men in Newburgh, New York. He acknowledged their frustration over Congress's failure to pay them for their service. But then, Washington warned them against doing anything rash that would destroy the honor they had earned during the war. He said, "Let me entreat you, gentlemen, on your part, not to take any measures which, viewed in the calm light of reason, will lessen the dignity and sully the glory you have hitherto maintained. Let me request you to rely on the plighted faith of your country, and place a full confidence in the purity of the intentions of Congress. And let me conjure you, in the name of our common country, as you value your own sacred honor, as you respect the rights of humanity, and as you regard the military and national character of America, to express your utmost horror and detestation of the man who wishes, under any specious pretenses, to overturn the liberties of our country, and who wickedly attempts to open the floodgates of civil discord and deluge our rising empire in blood." And with that appeal to honor, whatever conspiracy may have been in the works quickly fizzled. You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hi there, everyone. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about American history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode 103, in which we explore the idea of honor and how it played such a prominent role in the public discourse in the age of the American Revolution and early Republic. We are coming to you this week from the Newburgh Conspiracy Studios, located in central Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and our YouTube channel. Guiding us along, as always, is our executive producer, the oh-so-honorable Lulu Spencer. So what's happening in the Past Lane this week? Well, here in central Massachusetts, we're all pretending to get work done while thinking and talking nonstop about our mighty Red Sox. Now, I know most of you are not from New England, but hopefully you know what it's like to absolutely love a team and then find them in the World Series. And as history lovers, I hope you love the fact that this is a matchup between two of the most historic franchises in baseball. The last time the Dodgers and Red Sox squared off in the World Series was in 1916, 102 years ago. Boston, which was actually baseball's first dynasty back in the day, defeated the boys from Brooklyn, who were then called the Brooklyn Robins, 4-1. And in Game 2, a young star pitcher, yes, pitcher, named Babe Ruth, pitched 13 scoreless innings for Boston for the win. 13 innings. It was a different game back then. Anyway, there's great excitement here in Red Sox Nation. But don't worry, I promise to continue to crank out In the Past Lane episodes. In other news, lots of good things happening here at In the Past Lane. First off, we have still more Patreon supporters who have signed up to donate as little as $1 a month. Thanks to Patrick D. and Mike V., your generous contributions help pay for this podcast, things like podcast hosting, web hosting, and audio editing. And I really hope more of you will join them. Just go to inthepastlane.com and click on support. Thanks. Okay, coming up, I'll speak with historian Craig Bruce Smith about his new book, American Honor, The Creation of the Nation's Ideals During the Revolutionary Era. It's a fascinating look at how the founders differentiated between good and evil, right and wrong, just and unjust, and honorable and dishonorable, to make sense of their world and the cause of the American Revolution. Before we get to that conversation, if you want to learn more about this period of the founding and the Revolution, you can check out past In the Past Lane episodes, like episode 14 on the Declaration of Independence, or episode 23, where I talk to Stephen Knott about his book on Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, or episode 28, where I speak to historian Carol Birkin about her book on the fractious politics of the 1790s and how they led to the formation of American nationalism, or episode 41, on the Battle of Saratoga, the tipping point of the American Revolution, or episode 65, where I speak with historian Andrew O'Shaughnessy on why the British lost the Revolution, and episode 79, where I speak with historian Mitch Kashun about his book on the life and legend of Crispus Attucks. Okay, people, let's saddle up and proceed at an easy trot. Your journey in the past lane begins now. Our guest today is Craig Bruce Smith, and he is an assistant professor of history at William Woods University in Fulton, Missouri. He is the author of many scholarly works in early American history for publications like the William and Mary Quarterly and the Journal of Military History. He's here today to talk about his new book, American Honor, the creation of the nation's ideals during the Revolutionary Era. In the course of our conversation, Craig discusses what honor meant in 18th century American political culture and why it was such an important concept in the era of the American Revolution. How George Washington and the Patriots framed the American Revolution as a struggle to defend the honor of Americans against a dishonorable attempt by the British to oppress them, and how George Washington likewise depicted the treason of Benedict Arnold as evidence of the dishonorable nature of the British cause. Also, how women and the enslaved, and not just white male elites, made appeals to honor to gain greater rights and respect. How, at the end of the war, Washington defused a potential mutiny of Continental Army officers by invoking their sense of sacred honor. How honor in the young republic was gradually transformed from something tied to high birth and status into something one could earn by honorable conduct. And why honor, in the era of the Revolution, denounced dueling as a thoroughly dishonorable practice, and then how that changed as a very different definition of honor emerged in the early 1800s. Okay, time to bring on the guest historian. Craig Bruce Smith, welcome to In the Past Lane.
Well, thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you. So let's start. I want to start out with how you start your book, which is from a scene from 1774 where delegates to the Continental Congress gather and they explain in a declaration why they're gathering or under what pretext. And they say that we are, quote, associated under the sacred ties of virtue, honor, and love of our country. So honor clearly is a big term from the late 18th century. So I think it would be helpful for our listeners for you to get us started by telling us what exactly it means. It's a word everybody knows, but then people would offer very, very different definitions of what it meant. And certainly in the 18th century, it had different meaning as well. So get us started on what is meant by honor, because that's really at the heart of your book.
Well, you started with the hardest question first. So defining honor is something that has proved problematic throughout history as it remains today. And essentially, the term has changed in what it's meant over time, and it's also changed in what it's meant to individual people. The quick definition from a traditional standpoint is honor was tied to duty or reputation or proper conduct. The issue then became, what is proper conduct? Duty to what? Reputation to who? And in a traditional European sense, honor was something that was communal in that if others didn't recognize you as having honor, then you didn't have honor. And it was very much based on birth status and social hierarchy. However, during the Revolutionary era in America, it starts to change and it starts to evolve into something that's more centered around the idea of a service to a cause, and the cause being the revolution. And it ultimately morphs into something that's more internal, very similar to what we think of today as ethics. And it's my goal to invite the reader to, when they see the word honor in the context of an 18th century American patriot, to think of it in the term as we would think of as modern ethics. And it's literally a changing of words that happens in the modern 20th century that sort of altered our understanding. But by and large, it has to do with honor, reputation, but it's really closer to ethics and morality in the revolutionary context.
Well, I think that's a good starting definition. So it's clear that, you take, if one reads documents from the late 18th century, the word honor is all over the place. And in some cases, it shows up in some of our most memorable documents, probably the most important of all, the lines from the Declaration of Independence about pledging sacred honor. But for the last 40 years or so, at least that long, some historians have argued that a lot of this honor talk is, that we see in the late 18th century leading up to and through the Revolution was in many ways window dressing, that obscured other less honorable, if we will, motives about, personal motives, class motives, economic motives, motives such as preservation of slavery and maintenance of white supremacy. And you seem to be pushing back at least a little bit on that by saying, look, those things may be true, but honor as a concept needs to be taken seriously. So tell us if I've got that right, and also why that's an important point that you're making.
Oh, I think you have that exactly right. Now, my goal is not to necessarily push back or argue that there aren't economic or personal or racial or class issues that are going on in the American Revolution. But I do think there has been a larger turn in historical scholarship to dismiss anything any member of the founding generation says as rhetoric, as some attempt to conceal an ulterior motive, usually personal. So I am pushing back on that to the sense that this is a word that is pervasive throughout the 18th century. When I started this book, I knew I would find references, but I was shocked how many I found. And the fact that it exists amongst people of different races, classes, and genders, all using the terms in very, very similar fashion. So I am not saying that there are different interpretations for the causes and motivations of the American Revolution. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is when people, particularly academics, have focused on honor, they're focusing more on the darker side of honor culture. Again, this is the language of the duel.
Right.
That's the trappings of it. That's how people personally interpret it. It's not the actual term. And in fact, the duel, which everyone sort of assumes is honor, is considered to be dishonorable by most people in early America. And it's really only in the 19th century with its subsequent post-revolutionary generations that we really see this rise in dueling. And it's not held something in the revolutionary generation. The question everyone always says is how do you know people believe this? And it's a very difficult one, just like studies of religion. How do you know what a person believes? How do you know what a person thinks? And I think we're really bound to our source material.
Right.
The idea being, well, could someone lie? Absolutely they could. I like to look at how does thought influence actions. If they're saying their motivation is honor and they have to behave in a certain way to gain honor, and then they act in that fashion, I'm apt to take that seriously.
I guess also if you see them use the term in different ways, they use it in public pronouncements, but then also in their diary and then also in letters to other folks, and then the actions match that, I think that's pretty convincing. Exactly. It's not something that's just for public performance. It's in private documents. It's in personal correspondence. And if exactly like I said, the actions match, I'm apt to believe it. And the other thing is, I'd like to throw this out there. I don't know of anyone that's willing to die for rhetoric. Good point. These are individuals that are literally risking their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And as you mentioned earlier, the term sacred honor is something that's present in some of the key moments, the First Continental Congress, obviously the Declaration of Independence, and this term keeps making its appearance, and it's embraced by all different viewpoints on the Patriot side, but it's also something that's used by the British and the Loyalists, just in a varying perspective. Right. As we see that today in our own rhetoric, where people invoke. Everyone cares about honor. Yeah. Or also everybody cares about patriotism, and one person's patriotism can mean, taking a knee during the national anthem, and another one would be just, waving the American flag during the national anthem. So it's exactly very different interpretations. Well, one way to track people's, thoughts and actions, you begin pretty early on. So you kind of pull it back away from the high rhetoric of the revolution and sacred honor in that context to go back into the, experiences of people in the French and Indian War, George Washington's experiences as a debtor to London merchants, and also looking at a lot at colleges, too, the role that colleges played, because colleges, many of them had honor codes, and this is where you can kind of track the terminology and also the written word. So tell us about this pre-revolutionary period and the evolutions that you start seeing happening even before the revolution in how Americans understood honor. I think that this was an important part of the book in that if I just went into the revolution, you're not seeing the change. And so I felt it was really important to go into the colonial era. And there are references to even earlier, but the book largely starts with the birth of Benjamin Franklin and then jumps into the dual progression of Washington and Franklin in early chapters. And it's really looking at what was the Anglo-American or British Atlantic conception of honor in the colonial period. And
The American version and the British version were identical, one based on status and birth and reputation and communal reputation. And looking at Franklin as he likes to joke in his autobiography, the youngest son of the youngest son for 5 generations back, he's looking at different sources and making his own interpretations of honor as closer to based on merit rather than based on birth. And as early as the 1720s, he's talking of a concept he called ascending honor, whereby you gain honor based on your actions, not based on your parentage. And so that's as early as the 1720s. Washington, meanwhile, is more of the older style, based on his gentry-level birth and obviously his interactions with the aristocratic families and the Fairfaxes. But he also comes to a concept of merit through sort of facing slights during the French and Indian War by British officers, and also feeling that the Virginia militia is performing as well as and risking their lives just the same as any Englishman. Meanwhile, colleges, whether there's a formal code of honor or an informal one, are very much about setting almost a communal standard in a different sense, that everyone's sort of acting for themselves, for their own honor, but it also reflects on the other students, it reflects on the faculty, it reflects on the school. And colleges, again, it's not something that most early Americans would have attended, but it disproportionately, signers of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence are college educated. And they're really coming to these ideas from literary sources, much like Washington and Franklin had in private reading, but it's also institutionalized in the colleges in a way how they're supposed to act. They have punishments that are very much similar to honor-based punishments in militaries, where they be knocked down to lower ranks and lower classes. And it's really about establishing a collective sort of thought. So honor becomes a language that people can understand regardless of their regional location or their religious denomination.
Yeah, in some ways it's a micro version of what later you'll talk about as sense of national honor. This is an institutional honor, that being honest, being upright, being comporting oneself with virtue is not only good for you, but it's essential for the institution that you're affiliated with.
Exactly. And if you fail, it reflects on the institution and others there. So there's the inherent need for the individual and also others there to maintain this sort of lofty conduct.
Yeah. But the interesting thing about your book is that, on its face, you could see this as a study of how elites think and how they see the world unfolding around them, and how they reshape this idea of honor. But you talk quite a bit about how this idea finds currency at all levels of society, so that American women who are engaged in patriot behavior, most notably in forming boycotts and enforcing boycotts against British interests, and also African Americans, enslaved African Americans, use the term honor. Tell us more about these, small f founders, if we could think of them as a founding generation.
Yeah, and I'm glad you say that, because throughout the book, I never use the term founding fathers. I always use the term founders, because I want to speak more of a generation who is helping to shape the nation. So women, African Americans, both enslaved and freed, lower class whites are all using these concepts. There's subtle nuances naturally, but by and large, women who, as you know, are engaged in boycotts of British products are using the language of honor. And it's what allows women to enter the political sphere, and it is recognized that they are doing the same sort of work as men in supporting this cause. Therefore, they must be due in many ways to equal honor. When they, for instance, at the Edenton Tea Party, which is in North Carolina, where women gather to swear off tea, they're using the language of honor, and they're saying they're not just doing it for their families, they're doing it for themselves. This is something personal. Slaves are using this even have slaves using it earlier, but by the 1770s, you have slaves in Boston petitioning for their freedom, the idea that it would grant honor to those who extended it to them. The best example are African-American soldiers who are fighting in New England and elsewhere, who are afforded honor based on their conduct, and they receive these citations that their conduct has done honor as would have done to any man. They're compared to brave officers, and this is through their service to the cause. Again, I'm not saying it makes social hierarchy disappear. I'm saying that it opens up the discussion of different people having an ability to gain honor and therefore to gain a degree of social mobility. And it does tie into later on ideas of abolitionist thought, this idea of honorable people who are kept in bondage. And we also see it in lower classes. In fact, during the Revolution, a new term is coined, something that was completely foreign in the Anglo-American world, and this term is called gentlemen soldiers.
Right.
And for most of the 18th century, there's gentlemen officers, and soldiers in the British Army would have been considered the rabble. This is where you go if you have no other option.
Yeah, people that need to be driven.
Exactly. And they have to be led by a different group. But in America, in the militia ranks and in the Continental Army ranks, the term is actually used, gentleman soldier, that soldiers need to be gentlemen, and they too have a sense of honor, where in the older British model, honor was only reserved for elite classes.
Yeah, I found some of that writing in your book to be some of the most interesting ones, where in terms of the way that, there are a couple of things that happened during the Revolution. One is that the larger framing of it by founders and George Washington and others as the whole struggle is ultimately about honor, about maintaining what is emerging as a national honor versus being dishonored and violated by the British, by the king, by Parliament. And then the other is sort of redefining what honor is on the, as military people, isn't solely bound up in one's victories. And therefore, if you lose, you have no honor. Tell us more about this evolving sense, the way that Washington reframes what military honor is all about.
So I'm glad you noticed that the idea of honor is really at stake. And I'm not saying issues of taxation, representation, liberty, and freedom aren't there, but they're inherently intertwined. And if you go to the early sources, before they mention anything about taxes, they're talking about honor. Samuel Adams, I should say, links it with freedom and independence. So it's very much on those terms. Conversely, naturally, the British have a different interpretation. But as you note, the idea of military honor is something fundamentally different. And Washington and other officers move away from the older notion of you gain honor through victory. And America doesn't have necessarily a long-standing martial tradition aside from service and militia and then obviously the French and Indian War. So they're largely looking to military texts. And they're seizing on different passages within them, whether by Frederick the Great or General Bland or General Wolfe, these British officers. And they're focusing on the idea of how the army conducts itself. And it's more important to behave well in the field, to follow your orders, to perform your duty, to not be a drunken, vicious army committing all manner of offenses. If you lose and you maintain your duty, there can be honor there. And that matches perfectly with Washington's use of sort of Fabian tactics and using defensive strategies, only fighting when the odds are in your favor to maintain the army. And they're taking away ideas from different texts about the necessity of preserving your soldiers. In fact, the idea of preserving your soldiers, the lowest ranks in the army, is essential to maintaining honor. The idea, Washington's going to convey this to his own commanders, that no one will censure you for not fighting when the odds are against you, but if you lose when they are, then the whole world will focus and blame you. Paraphrasing a bit.
Right.
It basically, this new interpretation conforms with the style in which the American army has to fight, combined with the idea of holding certain rules of war and how you treat civilians, how you treat prisoners, how you behave on the field.
It's also a way of characterizing the British conduct of the war to be its absolute opposite, which is that it's a dishonorable army of invasion. And the atrocities and even the alleged atrocities and the depredations against civilian populations in places like New Jersey early on in the war really cast the British invasion of America as this dishonorable, savage army versus this much more honorable, scrappy continental army.
And that's exactly right. And it could be argued, obviously, in any war, there's going to be failings on both sides. But the idea is the Americans are very much conceptualizing it in, they want to win naturally, but they want to win well. They want to win this war by fighting in a proper way, as opposed to the manner in which the British are using it, how they are descending to tactics that are viewed as shameful in the minds of the colonists. And this is something that has occurred since as early as Lexington and Concord. Even earlier, the idea that Britain is fundamentally violating basic rights, and that's how they've failed.
Right, and in the middle of the war, or I guess a little bit towards the latter part of the war, Benedict Arnold becomes an important figure in the war and also in your story of this evolution of the notion of honor. Tell us about Arnold, because honor comes up in both ways. In his own sense of being dishonored plays a crucial role in his decision to become the most infamous traitor in American history, and then how George Washington chooses to talk about it is also key to understanding this new concept of honor. So tell us more about Benedict Arnold and honor.
So Arnold is very prominent, character throughout because he is so consumed with it. But Arnold represents sort of I term him sort of an anachronism, that he certainly fights for the United States. He does risk his life. He's perhaps the greatest battlefield commander on the American side in the war, one of the great heroes of Saratoga, and then he has this tremendous fall. And the question is why? And a lot of it has to do with how he frames this concept, his concepts of honor. And he's thinking more in the older personal sense. And as he's passed over by promotion by Congress for officers he feels are inferior, meaning that they're being advanced not on their own merit, he starts feeling slighted. When he's forced to take an oath of loyalty based on the Continental Congress, he will only take it to another general, Henry Knox. After he's wounded at Saratoga, he's placed as military governor in Philadelphia. He manages to throw himself a party without inviting any Continental Army officers. He's fundamentally viewing everything as a slight against him, and any advancement is not recognizing his skills as a commander, which he's not wrong. The other issues are, privately, he's accused of anything from insider trading to pillaging, and he's brought up on the court-martial charges earlier, and he is ordered to be punished by, and it's a really minor rebuke from Washington, on the line of, we wish General Arnold had not engaged in such conduct using sort of potentially military resources for personal gain. And it's a really light reprimand, but it's public, and it's by Washington. And Arnold had always felt that Washington was on his side, and it really shakes him. Arnold, by this point, is married into a loyalist family, and he begins a correspondence with Major John Andre, spy master and adjunct general to Henry Clinton. And the defection, the attempt to turn over West Point, is not – Arnold tries to make it clear it's not about money, despite the fact there is money, 20,000 pounds. It's not about the rank. He actually takes a downgrade in rank. He wants to show that this is fundamentally about how he has been dishonored. And the only way he could do this, to reclaim it, is to resist, because he needs to defend his reputation against the Congress particularly, but now also a Continental Army that has marginalized him. And this could have been the most devastating thing, this could have crushed the Continental Army, but it doesn't, largely because of how Washington spins it. And he uses the language of honor to say, look how lost the British are to honor, that they have to resort to such tactics. And how honorable are we that this has never happened before? And it becomes a moment like a Pearl Harbor or a 9/11 that sort of shocks everyone back into alignment. There had been lots of sort of civil military tension where each was blaming the other for a lack of winning the war. And within a year, the war's over. So does Benedict Arnold win the war for America? Maybe that's going a bit too far, but it sounds good.
Right. And it's a masterful moment for Washington, as you say, to use Arnold as this foil, essentially saying this is what we are not. And thank goodness there's only one of us that's turned, been tempted by these insidious offers from the British. And yeah, so the war does come to an end, but even then the questions of honor and questions of the national fate hang in the balance. And Washington is called upon again. I mean, as historians often point out, most revolutions end badly. They end and then they turn almost immediately into civil war and invariably end up with a strongman, a dictator at the head of the government. A very different outcome than what people thought was going to happen. And the American Revolution has many moments where that could have happened. And the Newburgh Conspiracy, as it's known, is one of those moments. So tell us what's going on with the American Officer Corps and at this moment, great moment of peril for the nation.
Yeah, so the Newburgh Conspiracy is potentially as dangerous a moment as any that occurs in the war. And takes place in 1783, not far from West Point. Newburgh's right along the Hudson, and the American Army, the Continental Army, is encamped there to sort of keep check on the British Army, who are still occupying New York. And there's rumors of a peace coming from Paris, but the war has not officially been over, though the major fighting has been done for approximately 2 years. And the Continental Army officers had been promised half pay for life. They haven't seen any money from Congress, who is short on cash. And a secretive letter is circulated calling for a meeting. And the traditional interpretation are there's two different possibilities of what's going on. One is that the officers of the army are literally going to lead a coup and take over Congress until they're paid. The second is that they were going to retreat past the mountains and just allow the British to march out of New York and do what they will. Because the feeling was among the officers, if the war ended before they were paid, Congress would not honor this agreement. So it's a very dangerous moment. Would have been similar to many revolutions. But Washington calls his own meeting, and he appeals to them, and he uses the word, not just honor, but sacred honor.
Right.
Going back to the Declaration in even the First Continental Congress. And he says, to paraphrasing, but look at what we've done. Look at what we've accomplished. And if we do this, it will all be for nothing. We have a duty to ourselves, to our nation. And he is able to convince his officers of this idea of, as he had from the start, of personal sacrifice for the greater good, that the most honorable thing is to contribute to the nation. And it's successful. And more than that, Washington, shortly thereafter, is going to resign his commission, returning power to the people. He would not be, a Cromwell or a Caesar. And it's fundamentally unlike anything that has happened before. And this is where he gets compared to classical figures like the Roman general Cincinnatus, who gives up dictatorial powers and returns to his farm.
Yeah, so there's two crucial moments, fairly close, and Washington, becomes the embodiment in many ways of this new kind of honor, and also the kind of the teacher or the exemplar of it. But as you point out, honor, it changes through this period, and it continues to change into the 1780s. And you talk in the latter chapters of your book about how honor is still about public reputation to some degree, but it increasingly becomes more an internal thing. Honor, in some ways, another word we use is conscience, that it becomes something about, what you do when no one's even looking. That's what's important.
Exactly. And this is largely coming from Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, who really sort of formulate a definition. And Franklin comes to this 1784 and Jefferson 1785. So Franklin returns to his concept that he had talked about in the 1720s of ascending honor, the idea that honor is due to the individual who behaves well and the person that taught them to do that, whether it's parents or teachers. And this in many ways conforms with in the sort of traditional historical writings, similar to the ideas of Republican womanhood, of raising the next generations of Americans. And he says that descending honor is, as it would be in Europe, is just a perversion of this, and it's not reflective on anything the individual has done. Meanwhile, Jefferson, from a more of a Virginian honor standpoint, where reputation was certainly in the colonial era was have been paramount, compares it to conscience. And he says, imagine if the whole world were watching and never do a dishonorable thing. And he's saying that you, though no one may ever know, you have to act a certain way. But he uses that older language to say, imagine everyone was watching. Imagine your reputation's on the line. And even though it's not, you still can't behave that way. And this is what it really becomes. This is something that's happened throughout the war. I should say throughout the Revolutionary era, but it's really becomes clearly defined immediately after the end of the war.
And would you say that this new evolving sense of honor in some ways reflects some of the democratic ideals, small d, of the revolution, that if honor is about how you conduct yourself even when no one's watching, in many ways it individualizes and democratizes the idea of honor?
Oh, exactly right. And the term I use, sort of democratized honor or Americanized honor, to mean it becomes accessible to virtually everyone in society, in that are there nuances to it? Yes, but the agreement is sort of a holding to an idea of a greater good, of supporting the nation, supporting the cause, supporting society, but it's something that anyone could aspire to and anyone could gain through this conduct, whereas in the older European model, it was inherently tied to birth. Yes, there's possibilities of people acquiring honor perhaps, but it still fundamentally came to where did you fall in the social hierarchy.
And what happens to this evolving sense of honor in the 1790s, which we think of historically as one of the most bitter and fractious periods in American history, where two emerging political parties really go to war against each other, and personal invective and personal challenges to one's honor become an important part of that politics? What does that mean for the notion of honor? And then eventually we'll get back to where we were earlier in talking about the emergence of dueling as something tied to honor in a new way.
So it's obviously, as you note, the emerging political parties, whether it's starting in the constitutional era with Federalists and Anti-Federalists, or then Democratic Republicans and Federalists, both sides are very much using the terms of national honor. And they each claim to have the honor of the nation at heart. But the inherent problem is each accuses the other of not regarding it. And there is tension during the constitutional era, but this is really sparked by the French Revolution and the older alliance of 1778, whereas are Americans required to aid the France in the French Revolution? This is where you get your traditional Jeffersonian, Hamiltonian, well, the king is dead, that we have no tie, versus no, our tie is to the people of France. And Washington obviously maintains neutrality because he feels it's what is best for the nation. And it's through this era that this starts to evolve, where each claims they're doing what is best. Early on, you could still have ideas of people, though they're politically opposed, they'll still speak of each other's sort of private conduct as being honorable. But as we progress further, it becomes inherently politicized, whereby Aaron Burr can be reviled on one side, but still be a man of honor to the other. And this is when, in some ways, you have these sort of challenges arising. But by and large, it's still cast in the same sort of definition of honor of the nation above the self. And this refers to a proper conduct rather than in the sort of more violent aspects that are going to develop in the 19th century.
Right. So tell us about how we get there, because I think, as you noted earlier, a lot of us think of honor as being somehow tied to dueling, when in fact dueling was seen as dishonorable behavior up through the end of the 18th century. But then suddenly dueling literally explodes as a form of personal behavior and also a form of politics, including, most famously, Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. So how does that switch occur, and what does it mean?
So the Hamilton-Burr duel is probably the most famous duel in American history. And the interesting thing is it starts a bout of anti-dueling. It starts a tremendous anti-dueling wave. Just to put it in perspective, prior to 1800, there had only been 75 duels in American history. After 1800, through the rest of the 19th century, there are at least 750. Those are known duels.
Yeah.
It's illegal in a lot of places, so who knows what the number actually is. So the Hamilton-Burr duel, which is taking place by members of the revolutionary generation, sort of shocks. It's another one of these shocking moments. Hamilton, who professes to not support dueling, does in fact duel. But the reaction is largely Burr as losing honor, and also Hamilton, sort of the idea of this is almost as if a murder-suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And it's cast in the terms of what could both of these men have done for the nation? What could they have still done for the nation? And they've sacrificed it for their own personal reasons. And it turns many avowed duelists, even in the South, to anti-dueling. And you have foundations of anti-dueling societies. And there's a real pushback against this. So where do all these 750-plus duels come from? They're largely coming from not the revolutionary generation, but the next generation and the one after. Their sons and grandsons who are trying to measure up to their revolutionary fathers and grandfathers and don't have this sort of glorious cause to make their way. And they're going back to this older sense. They're going back to ways of trying to prove themselves. And the most readily available way to prove themselves becomes not just dueling, but engaging in violence. In the War of 1812 is very much cast as sort of a duel between nations. And we see this idea of building up through the Civil War, where you have two fundamentally different conceptions of honor that exist at the same time. But we have the idea of personal honor has this resurgence. And the way to advance is to advance yourself personally. And then you could do service to the nation, as opposed to the primary goal should be serve the nation. And that in turn gives you honor.
Right. And the prime example of that is another, probably the second most famous duelist in American history, which is Andrew Jackson. Tell us how he fits in there, because he does ascend through these personal feats and then goes on to serve the nation as a president.
Exactly right. So Jackson very much is, I view him as a model of sort of reviving the older sense of honor. So Jackson from the Carolina frontier, he's often portrays himself in his has his biographers portray him as a man of the people of humble origins. In some ways he is, but he has an older sort of Scots-Irish gentry level understanding of himself. And if you look at his early biographies, it very much brings about this sort of higher rank from family in Ireland. And Jackson fundamentally considers himself a gentleman. And he does hold on to this, but in some of the older sort of folkways of Celtic clan traditions, he's holding largely at the dictates of his mother to settle matters of assault yourself, not to resort to sort of traditional law. And he uses sort of violence and war to advance himself. Again, obviously, he famously kills a man in a duel in 1806. But what's interesting, in the aftermath of the Hamilton-Burr duel, it said that he wouldn't have been able to get elected had he run at that point because of that.
Right.
But he comes of age. Again, he's briefly involved in the American Revolution, and he tries desperately to tie himself there. But he's very much more identifiable with the sort of new men. And he makes his way in the French-Indian War, the War of 1812, fighting against natives in the Southeast, and then later against the British in New Orleans. And he very much goes against traditional concepts of rules of war that would have been in text by Vattel, or that had been advanced by Continental Army generals like Nathaniel Greene. And he starts to say that, well, honor and certain conduct is only reserved for certain types of people. And again, obviously Native Americans he dismisses from this. So he allows himself to use brutal tactics as the idea of certain people are not do this. And it's very much an older sense. And he uses his conduct in the war, his gaining honor from victory and on the battlefield to allow himself to advance. And he is a avowed duelist. It's, the old lore says he kept 30 pairs of pistols at the ready. So he tries to connect to the revolutionary side, but he's very much looking to something older, whereby you gain advancement based on your bravery, your actions in the field. And then you could go, once that is acquired, you can then serve the nation.
Right. It's a very, very interesting shift. Well, by way of kind of wrapping this up, this has been a really interesting conversation. I always ask the people I speak with, why does this story matter now? Is there a takeaway in 2018 when we think about the fractious politics that we are living through, and where questions of what does the other side intend? Does the other side have any virtue, any honor, any morality, any ethics, I guess to use the proper term, or the modern term? How does what you've written about matter now?
I think it fundamentally does, and this wasn't written necessarily for any political bend or advancing any motive. This is something that I firmly believe that honor is still relevant in today's society. And I think it exists. I think we're just using a different term, and that's ethics. I think the takeaway here is the ideas that Washington really put forward in his conduct, the idea of national honor above the self, the idea of individuals, particularly in positions of leadership, have the obligation to serve what is in the interest of the nation first, and to behave in a manner that reflects on the national interest. So we know honor has been used by varying political parties, but the idea of honor as proper conduct is ethics. The idea that our leaders and individuals, not just leaders, but everyone in society should behave in a proper way and should hold themselves accountable. And at the same time, think about how their actions reflect the greater numbers of society and the nation. And I think that's something that's fundamentally important, not just for politics, but occasionally you'll hear the terms honor used by politicians. But the question is, how is it being used? And I think if we went to it as this idea of ethical behavior, this would help whatever political side you're on, left, right, or center. I think it's something that really can be embraced and would be a great benefit to nearly everyone in society.
Yeah, I think that's one of the important ways of thinking about the founding generation, which is that they don't give us very specific answers because our world is so fundamentally different. But they do offer some very wise and helpful insights into how we should, continue to build and maintain the republic into the future. And one of them is that notion of selfless, ethical service as being kind of essential. I mean, if you lose that, or if that diminishes, then it diminishes the republic. I think that's a pretty good insight for our times now. Well, Craig Bruce Smith, this has been a great conversation, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us at In the Past Lane. Thanks so much.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Craig Bruce Smith is the author of American Honor, The Creation of the Nation's Ideals During the Revolutionary Era, published by University of North Carolina Press and available everywhere. You can follow Craig on Twitter at Craig Bruce Smith. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to show your love for the podcast, you can buy some of our merchandise. Just go to inthepastlane.com and click on merchandise. There you'll see more than 50 t-shirts with In the Past Lane logos, not to mention a whole line of shirts with history quotes from notable people like Abraham Lincoln, who once said, "Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history." And Mark Twain, who said, "History does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme." And remember, everything you see at our merchandise page comes as a hoodie, water bottle, coffee mug, stickers, you name it. So check it all out at inthepastlane.com. Thanks. Okay, people, that's all for this episode of In the Past Lane. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to this podcast at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Overcast, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world. So let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the Past Lane. Hey, Lulu, looks like you have a question.
Yeah, exactly how did you become historian at large?
Really? I'm so glad you asked. See?
Never mind.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.